So if you would like to read along, just open your Bibles in Mark chapter 10. We're going to read today from verses 32 to verse 52. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." And Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink of the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We're able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I was baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. But for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many." And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way.
So this is the third message on this series called The Way of the Cross. This quote summarizes the idea of this series. We are called to embrace a cruciform life in which the cross doesn't simply teach us that Christ has died, but teaches us how to live. The cross has a message, and the cross has a calling. The cross calls us for changing our lives. The question that we are trying to answer is this one here. How has the cross shaped our lives, guided our decisions, forged our character, and impacted our relationships? We could put simply that way, what does a cruciform life look like? We already had two messages. The first one, we talked about self-denial. In the second one, we talked about service. You'll see that this is a 4-Sunday sermon series, and each Sunday, we'll talk about one characteristic, one aspect of this cruciform life. And the 4 aspects start with the letter S. Number 1, self-denial. Number 2, service. And today, we'll talk about sacrifice. The 3rd S in our series is sacrifice. Let's understand what the text is saying in here. The text says that Jesus and the disciples, they were on the road. Notice the word, the road going up to Jerusalem. This is the way of the cross. And Jesus was walking ahead of them. Jesus is the leader, and the disciples are followers. And there were a kind of mix of feelings. They were amazed. And those who followed were afraid. So they knew that Jerusalem was not a safe place. But they had great expectations in this trip to Jerusalem. And then, in the midst of this trip, in the road, the text says that Jesus began to tell them what was to happen to him. And we understand, reading the Gospel of Mark, that this was already the 3rd time that Jesus was telling them what was about to happen when they arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." So you understand, Jesus is very clear in here. Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. And the question here is, what does Jesus see? What are Jesus' expectations? Jesus is going up to Jerusalem, and he sees the cross. He knows, I am going to the cross. This way is a way where I have this expectation. But now, see how the disciples were seeing. How the disciples, how was their expectation in this travel, this way to Jerusalem. The text says, verse 35, that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, I can call them like the JJ disciples, the sons of Zebedee came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you of you." So imagine, I think this is a very bold asking, right? Do for us whatever we ask of you. So Jesus is going to Jerusalem. He sees the cross. But the disciples are going and they are, okay, we want something. And Jesus answered, and this is I would say, the million-dollar question for us today. What do you want me to do for you? In other words, what do you expect from me? Jesus is saying. And then their answer is, verse 37, they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." Imagine that. You can think this is very awkward, absurd. But let's remember that in Matthew chapter 19, we have another account of the facts. And in the same context, Matthew says that Jesus said to them in Matthew chapter 19, verse 28, "Truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So Jesus had told them, hey, when I come in my kingdom, you guys will sit in 12 thrones. So James and John, they are going to Jerusalem. They think that Jesus is going to establish the kingdom in Jerusalem. And then they say, well, Jesus, you said that we would sit on 12 thrones. We are just asking a small thing. We already be there in thrones. So grant to us to sit on your right and on your left. We are not asking anything that you already promised, just a matter of positions. But you see that Jesus is going to Jerusalem, like I said, and Jesus sees the cross. But the disciples, they are going to Jerusalem, and what they see thrones. You can catch from the text a great mismatch of expectations. The disciples, they are seeing prominence, greatness, distinction, prestige. But Jesus, in reality, Jesus is seeing betrayal, rejection, suffering, death. So Jesus is aware and he is walking the way of the cross. And the disciples, they think they are in the way of glory, the way of prominence, greatness. Jesus immediately says this. Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking." In other words, Jesus is saying, you cannot see. You are blind. You want the throne, but you are not seeing the cross. You want power and honor, but you are not able to discern the cost. You want to be seen by everybody, but you cannot see anything. So there is this big and huge contrast here. And from that contrast, we understand we have the first great lesson for us today. The way of the cross is a way of rejection and suffering. This is the way of the cross. Rejection and suffering. Jesus said many times about suffering, about persecution. We have two examples of this here. One, John chapter 15, verse 20. "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you." And in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says, "I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves." This is a very clear, self-explained illustration. Sheep in the midst of wolves. "For they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. Brother will deliver brother over to death. And the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake." So Jesus is establishing here that the way of discipleship, in this way, we need to be prepared. We need to adjust our expectations. Do you remember the million-dollar question, what do you want? What do you want? What do you expect in your journey with Christ? You need to understand, first of all, here in this passage, that persecution is the normal course of the Christian life. If you want to be a disciple, you need to understand that this means going against the flow. Disciples go against the flow because they are following Jesus. And think about this and this challenge for us today. It's a great challenge because we live in this age, I would say, obsessed with likes. This is our world today. We are like obsessed for validation, affirmation, acceptance. We are living this consumeristic age where a product, the quality of a product is determined not by the qualities, but by the reviews. Today, you buy things not based on the brand, but based on the reviews. You go to Amazon, okay, I have 4.5, 4.8, okay, it's a good product. Popularity replaces quality. So this is our role today. We don't see suffering as a good thing. Everything that we do in our lives is to avoid suffering. We are not willing to go through this valley of suffering. There is this quote from a very old book, The Imitation of Christ, 1427. Thomas A. Kempis said, Jesus today, and this was 1427. Jesus today has many who love his heavenly kingdom, but few who carry his cross. Many who yearn for comfort, few who long for distress. Plenty of people he finds to share his banquet, few to share his fast. Everyone desires to take part in his rejoicing, but few are willing to suffer anything for his sake. There are many that follow Jesus as far as the breaking of bread, few as far as drinking the cup of suffering. Many that revere his morality, few that follow him in the indignity of his cross. Many that love Jesus as long as nothing runs counter to them. Many that praise and bless him as long as they receive comfort from him. But should Jesus hide from them and leave them for a while, they fall to complaining or becoming deeply depressed. Those who love Jesus for his own sake, not for the sake of their own comfort, bless him in time of trouble and heartache as much as when they are full of consolation. This is very old, but this is very relevant to our days. What Jesus is saying here is that the way of the cross is a way of rejection and suffering. And the fact is that these JJ brothers, they were not able to see that. They wanted thrones, but Jesus wanted a cross. The question for us today is, if the way of the cross, if the way of discipleship is a way of rejection and suffering, the great question is, how should we respond and walk this way? Because there are many different ways you can respond to suffering, to persecution, to rejection. Okay? We can think about retaliation. You can think about victimization. You can think about complaining, unbelief. All of these, they are responses to suffering. But in this passage, Jesus talks to us about a different way. Jesus is talking here about sacrifice. But let's understand that. The answer that Jesus gives to these JJ brothers, verse 38, are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? You can understand that Jesus here is talking about the cross, about his death. And Jesus uses two metaphors, two illustrations to explain his death. And JJ brothers, they are not understanding it. Jesus is saying, Jesus uses these two images, the cup and baptism. And what is Jesus teaching with these two images? This is very important because this is the point of this passage. Let's understand. First, let's talk about the cup. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Of course, Jesus is talking about his death. You remember that Jesus will pray in the Gethsemane. He will say, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. So he's talking about his death. But notice the language. What's the meaning of the cup? In the Bible, throughout the Bible, you understand that the cup is a metaphor for an individual's fate. The cup is something that is given to me by God. We read in the Old Testament many passages talking about the cup. There is the cup of salvation. There is the cup of consolation. There is the cup of blessing. And most common, there is the cup of God's wrath. The cup is something that God has prepared for us. Let me explain that. Judas was about to deliver Jesus, to betray Jesus and to deliver Jesus to the religious leaders. The religious leaders, they were about to deliver Jesus to Pilate, the Roman authority. And at the end, Pilate will deliver Jesus to the soldiers. So you can think, who is guilt in this human conspiration to kill Jesus? Judas, the religious leaders, Pilate, soldiers. You can think about that. In a human perspective, Jesus could go to the cross in this way, thinking that those agents are responsible for his death, and they were. But Jesus has a bigger vision. Behind of these human agents, Jesus can see God's eternal purpose in his death. Jesus understands that more than a human conspiration, there is a cup that he would drink. God was doing this. This was part of God's plan. And if you don't agree with me, you can read Acts chapter 2, verse 23. On the day of Pentecost, Peter will say, preaching the gospel, this Jesus, notice that, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. So you can understand here that when Jesus refers to his death, he is not talking about human conspiration. He's talking about an eternal plan of redemption. When we understand that our sufferings, that the persecution we have to face, they are not just human things. They are part of something bigger. Our response is different. In Jesus, we use the second analogy to explain this response. Because the first question is, are you able to drink the cup? Are you able to accept and embrace God's will for your life, even if it represents going against the flow, going against the world? Are you able to drink this, to embrace God's plan for your life? The second question, are you able to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? So the cup shows us something that comes from God to us. And how should we respond to God? Baptism is a symbol of our commitment to God. When we enter in a relationship of, in a kind of alliance with God, and this is baptism. When we die to ourselves into the waters, and we raise to be a new creature, to be a new person. Baptism is a symbol of commitment, death and life. The Apostle Paul will say to the Romans, chapter 6, do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? This is a personal identification. When you are baptized, you are saying, hey, I am like Jesus. I am identifying myself with Jesus. He died and resurrected. So I will repeat this movement in my baptism. So baptism is a response to God. When you understand the cup and the baptism, you understand that Jesus is teaching here, and this is the first point. Embracing the cross means offering our lives as a sacrifice to God. When you suffer for Christ, when you are rejected for Christ's sake, you need to understand this in terms of a sacrifice you are making to God. The Apostle Paul will say in a very clear way for us to understand. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So every kind of, every story of martyrdom in the history of the church is a story of worship. Because we worship God, because we drink the cup of God's plan, because we are baptized in his death, we understand that whatever happens to us, we can respond in terms of making a sacrifice to God. Not to achieve nothing from God, but in our way of discipleship, following Jesus in that way. So the first point, when we think about the cup and baptism, we understand that Jesus is teaching about how we respond, and this is sacrifice to God. Offer your life to God. So you are being rejected. Instead of retaliate, think, how can I offer myself in sacrifice to God as a response to that rejection? How can I respond in sacrifice to God? So the text continues. Not only sacrifice to God, the text says that when the 10 heard it, and the text is talking about the request, grant us to sit on your right and on your left. When the 10 of the disciples, the rest of the disciples, they heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. Why? Why they were indignant? Because they were conscious about, hey, you are being selfish. You are not seeing that Jesus is going to the cross. Hey, be humble. My personal conviction is that they were indignant, not because they could see better, but because J.J. Brothers came first than the 10. Because they would like the same, right? And then someone comes first and take your place. And they say, why? So there was a huge problem here. They were fighting now. And then the text says, Jesus called them all disciples, to him, and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. He uses two words, servant and slave, diakonos and doulos. Those who were in a very, very position of serving others. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus is teaching that the disciple grows downward. We can remember why John the Baptist was considered by Jesus the biggest one. Because John the Baptist said, he must increase, I must decrease. John the Baptist understood the way of the cross. And the point here is that when we suffer, when we are rejected, our response is not only a sacrifice to God, but also, in second place, a sacrifice for others. It's easy to say, oh no, I'm making a great sacrifice for God, to God. But sometimes the way that we see that you are really making a sacrifice to God is when we see if you are doing a sacrifice for others. And this is what Jesus is saying here, to give his life as a ransom for many. So a true disciple goes against the flow, not only because they put God in the first place, they make sacrifices for God, but they also make sacrifice for others. They put others above them. You remember 1 John chapter 3. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. So, the way of discipleship is a way of sacrifice. This is the way we respond to suffering, to rejection, to persecution. Sacrifice, offering our lives in sacrifice. So, how should we respond and walk this way? Two things here that Jesus is saying. Sacrifice to God and sacrifice for others. But before we finish here, the lesson is clear. But Jesus wants to give a very tangible example to consolidate the message, to explain the message in a very visible way. And then we have this story about the blind man called Bartimaeus. And pay attention to that, because this is the closing of the story. Mark puts the two stories together. We know that Jesus was going to Jerusalem, and the last stop before Jerusalem was Jericho. And we know by the Gospel of Luke that, and also the other Gospels, that many things happened there in Jericho. But notice that Mark goes forward, right? Straight forward. They came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho, so he doesn't say nothing about what happened in Jericho. And we know, for example, the story of Zacchaeus happened there. But Mark doesn't talk anything about that. And more than that, there is a question that unites both stories. What do you want me to do for you? The same question that Jesus made to J.J. Brothers is the same question that he will make to Bartimaeus. Verse 36 and verse 51. And why is that? Because Jesus wants to establish a contrast between these two brothers and Bartimaeus. And what can we learn about this contrast? Let's see here. James and John, they are the sons of Zebedee. The text is very clear to position James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And then Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. James and John, they wanted to sit in thrones. They wanted prominence. And Bartimaeus, the text says that he was sitting by the roadside, completely despised, invisible, no prominence at all, no glory at all. James and John asked for glory, but Bartimaeus, the text says, cried for mercy. Son of David, have mercy on me. James and John could see in a physical way, but they were blind to understand the spiritual reality that Jesus was teaching. Bartimaeus, although he was blind in a physical way, he was able to see Jesus. James and John wanted to be seen. Hey, we'll be in thrones and everybody will look at us and say, wow, these are the guys. James and John, J.J. Brothers, they are there. Bartimaeus just wanted to see, not to be seen. Not to be seen. So when we see these two stories in here, we can think about our own answer to the question, what do you want me to do for you? Imagine that Jesus comes to you today, and Jesus says this, what do you want me to do for you? And then you think about your life. You think about your problems. You think about, oh, Jesus, you know, I need a job, Jesus. I need a job. Or, oh, Jesus, you see my husband. Jesus, you need to touch him. This man is terrible, Lord. Or we have lots of immigrants here. Jesus, I want my permanent residence here in Canada. Or Jesus, you see my son is involved with bad friendships, and he's having like a problem, a temptation with drugs. Jesus, you see my life. I imagine that the text says that Bartimaeus was a blind, but he was also a beggar. In a very tangible way, many could think that a beggar wants money. Bartimaeus could ask Jesus, hey, you are asking me what do you want from me to do for you? Okay, Jesus, maybe some money would be great for me, right? I'm a beggar. But when Bartimaeus says, I want to see, Bartimaeus is able to identify his greatest problem. And sometimes we are not able to identify. We are not able to make a difference between our real needs and our wishes. You have many wishes, but what are your needs? Bartimaeus was able to see Jesus, to claim for Jesus. And the text finishes saying, immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Jesus, we can say here that Bartimaeus wanted to see Jesus and to understand the way and to follow the way. Bartimaeus wanted to see the way. What's the way, Jesus? I want to follow you. But in order to do that, I need to see. So I'd like to finish here saying this. In the way of the cross, we are all Bartimaeus. In the way of the cross, we are all Bartimaeus. Number one, going against the flow. Going against the crowds. The crowds were saying, Bartimaeus, be quiet. You are interrupting Jesus here. You don't see, he's a busy man. Bartimaeus goes against the flow. He was able to understand that the way of discipleship is a way of persecution. You need to go against the flow. Bartimaeus is crying out for Jesus' mercy. Because when we see our lives, we see, hey, we don't deserve this. So you just cry for mercy. You don't cry for vengeance on your enemies. You don't cry for God to kill your enemies. No, you cry for mercy on you. In the way of the cross, we are all Bartimaeus, learning to see from Jesus' perspective. I would say that the great goal in this discipleship pathway is to put our vision like the vision of Jesus. J.J. brothers, they wanted thrones and Jesus wanted a cross. There was this mismatch of expectations. But when we see Jesus' way and we follow Jesus because we have the same perspective. Do you want the same thing that Jesus wants? This is the question. We need to learn to see from Jesus' perspective. And the last one, following Jesus in the way. Even if this way is the way of the cross. So the point here, the message today is about sacrifice. We have, for sure, we have hope. Next Sunday, I'll talk about salvation, the fourth S. Because the way of the cross kills you, but at the same time, promises to you a new life, salvation, forgiveness. But for today, we need to understand that there is no resurrection without death. There is no resurrection without a cross. If you want to be resurrected with Christ, you need to die. You need to go to the cross with Christ. There is a cup that we need to drink. There is a baptism that we need to go in response to God. So your life and mine are marked with sacrifice. Are we able to understand and to embrace the way of the cross? It's very difficult. I'm not deceiving you here. I won't say, hey, come to Christ, and Christ will fix your problems. I won't say here, come to Christ, and Christ will bless you abundantly, so you'll be a victor, a winner, and nobody will resist you in this way. No, I won't say that. Jesus is saying, hey, are you able to drink the cup? Are you able to be baptized? This is the way of the cross. There is a sacrifice. We do sacrifice. We sacrifice for things that we value. If you value Jesus above all, you are able to follow him wherever he leads you.